The sea at the end of the world smelled like iron and old secrets, and the wind off it cut like a knife. John stood on the easternmost height of the wall with his gloved hands on the rim of frozen stone, looking out where the ancient ice bit into the shivering sea. Below him, Eastwatch by the sea hunched like a tired dog, towers white with rime, black harbor masts rimed with hoarfrost, the short stretch of pebble strand where waves muttered and froze at the edges. He had seen many seas. He had crossed a few. None felt as near to death as this one, where the water itself could turn traitor and harden underfoot at a whisper from the cold. "You look as if you think staring will make the dead come faster," Ed Tollett said, the breath of his words a pale ghost that hurried away from his mouth. "They're coming whether I look or not," John answered. "I prefer to see. Suit yourself. I prefer to be inside where my snot doesn't freeze in my nose. But I suppose Lord Commanders don't choose for comfort." "Hells, who would be a Lord Commander? You get a fancy title and people send you letters not to die." "You sent me letters," John said. "I said not to die," Ed replied. "I didn't say you had to come to the end of the world to do it." John took the jest and the concern beneath it with a nod. Eastwatch's garrison moved like slow shadows below. Men of the Night's Watch in patched black, free folk in furs of fox and bearskin, a knot of red-bearded giants of men among them moving logs by the pier, hammer blows ringing like iron bells from the old smithy near the seawall. He had counted every hand the day he came. Fewer than he wished, more than he had expected. Tormund had clapped him on the back until his teeth rattled and named him clever for choosing the shore. "The dead walk from anywhere they please," Tormund had said in that first council, voice rough as a cliff. "But they like easy ground. A coastline is good ground, flat, clear, cold as a widow's bed. If you mean to fight them, you choose where the ground is meaner than you are. Yet here we're trapped between the wall and the sea," Ed had said. "If they break us, there's nowhere to go but into the water. Then we make the sea our ally," John had replied. "We turn their numbers against them." He had sent ravens to Winterfell, to Dragonstone, to White Harbor and Bear Island and Deepwood Motte. He had written in the plainest hand he could manage with his frost-stiff fingers. "The dead are marching along the coast. We will meet them at Eastwatch. Send fire, pitch, rope, ships if you have them, men if you can spare any, and prayers if you can spare only breath." In his letters to Sansa he had written her name twice before breaking the quill and starting anew, because every letter to her carried the weight of everything he had not said the day he rode south. In his letter to Daenerys Targaryen he had written fewer words, each one chosen and turned like a knife. "Come north. Bring your fire." There had been answers. From Sansa, matter of fact and warm beneath the surface. "You will have men. We are cold and hungry like everyone else, but we are not fools." From Lady Mormont, a scrawl like claw marks. "The dead take nothing from Bear Island. Not a hearth. You'll have what we can spare and more." From White Harbor, Wyman Manderley's clerk's neat hand. "A ship of whale oil and 2 of tar. They will not sail quickly, but they will sail surely." From Deepwood, Asha Yara, Greyjoy's curt note. "Euron prowls like a shark in warm water. I will send what I can by land, not by sea." From Dragonstone, the quill scratched and left him waiting days longer than he liked, until a raven beat itself against the Eastwatch rookery window one dawn, and he tore the twine with clumsy eagerness. The letter bore a hand he knew now, Tyrion's measured courtesy, edged with urgency. "The Queen considers. She will have counsel from all who know anything of this foe and this place. If she comes swiftly." John turned from the white plain of the sea and looked down the wall stairs. Davos was there, cheer in his eyes despite the cold, a roll of rough parchment tucked into his belt like a sword. Davos Seaworth had been a smuggler and a knight and a hand and perhaps a father in all but blood. He was also the only man John trusted to make a plan of ropes and would stand up to winter and walking corpses. "We've marked out the first trench line along the strand," Davos said, falling into step beside him as they descended. "The free folk dig like they were born to it. The second line will take longer. The ground's like iron, and old stone under it. We'll do it. But there's the wall of the harbor to think of too. The wall stands. It stands for men, Davos said mildly. Not for things that don't mind being burned unless you burn them properly. The pitch from White Harbor will make a hell of a light show, but that ship won't be here for a fortnight or more if the winds are unkind. We've scrounged lamp oil and whale oil from every old barrel in the place. It's something, but I'd sooner not bet my life on the dregs of some fisherman's luck. Gendry, Jon asked when they reached the yard. Hammer strokes rang under the old roof, and the air that billowed out was warmer, alive with the scent of hot metal and burned leather. The boy, no, the man, had arms like thick cords now, eyes bright as a forge. He looked so much like Robert Baratheon in certain lights that even Davos sometimes flinched, and then they both pretended not to have done it. Sharpens as if he means to put an edge on the world, Davos said. Obsidian is sour stuff for a smith. Shatters if you're careless. But he's clever. He has arrowheads enough for every eye that can see. Bolts tipped hard as sin for those big crossbows we've taken to calling scorpions because it makes the watchmen feel like they serve in a story. Dragonglass doesn't help with whites, Jon said. Helps with the ones that lead them. Davos gave him a sideways look. You've killed one. I have. The steel helped that day too. Valyrian steel helps most days, Davos said. But we can't conjure 20 more Longclaws. We'll aim for the white ones with what we have and roast the rest with fire. The Hound says he'll handle anything that comes across with a head larger than a horse's. Sandor Clegane bent low over a length of chain at that moment, swear word steady as his hands. He had drifted toward the wall by a crooked road, following visions he claimed he did not believe in and debts he would not name. He worked like a penitent now because work kept his mind from things he would not voice. When he straightened and saw Jon looking, his mouth tugged sideways. Best plan I've heard is to throw you from the top of the wall with a torch in your hand and see if the dead are stupid enough to follow it, he said. That's the second best plan, Beric Dondarrion put in, stepping out from behind the Hound with his patched cloak and his worn kindness. The flaming sword hilt at his hip looked as natural as a hand he'd been born with. The best is to set a trap that kills more of them than it does of us. It must do more than that, Jon said. It must show them we can hurt them. We waste ourselves if all we do is burn their edges and let their core come on. We need to break them. Not forever, nothing is forever, but enough to teach them there is a price for them too. You speak as if they think, Thuras murmured from the hearth of the smithy, where he had been warming a skin of sour wine as if it were a prayer. They send bears where you're weak and lie quiet where you are strong. They think or something in them does. We'll think harder. That's all there is. They walked the strand after Davos, Jon, Tormund, Ed, the Hound grumbling like a bear and Beric quiet as snowfall. Men below them hauled out old nets and stretched them between iron pins beaten into the permafrost. The nets had been patched and reknotted until they looked more knot than rope. Tar-smeared brushwood lay beside trenches that were little more than cuts into frozen ground. Men carried barrels that sloshed. The scent of oil was thick as in a lampseller's den. They had labored for days, and days more would follow, until the strand was a web of lines and lures and cruel surprises. Beyond the second trench rose a low, ugly palisade built from ship timbers and scavenged masts. Behind it, a killing field of cleared snow that hid shallow pits lined with sharpened stakes and brush for burning. It would be a fine place to slaughter men, Ed said cheerfully, which was to say without cheer at all. Shame how the ones we face don't mind being slaughtered. They mind, Tormund said. Maybe they don't mind, but they answer. You break one of the thin blue-eyed bastards, and 100 of the dead fall like you cut their strings. Even the dead have strings, so we cut them. You go for the walkers, Jon said. I'll go for whichever one looks like he's telling the rest where to put their feet. Tall, colder than the others, Beric said. You know him when you see him. You know him when you feel him, the Hound muttered, and rubbed at old burns on his face as if they itched under the cold. By dusk, a dozen riders had returned from the north with their ponies blowing steam and white rime in their beards. The lead scout slid off his saddle with his legs stiff from cold and knelt, because his knees gave out not for ceremony. Jon knelt with him and took his arm and lifted him up again. How far? John asked. Hard to say, the man said, blinking eyes red from wind. The storm comes and goes before them. There's a stretch along the shore where the wind is like knives and you can't hear your own breath. But when it eases, there's a line of dark moving along the sea's edge. It's wrong, my lord, you'll forgive me. Things that should not be walking. The white ones ride, and the others, you know what the others do. How many? Davos asked. A count. Use your fingers to show if your tongue won't. The man showed his empty hands. Then he put his hands together and made a shape that meant too many, and they all knew it. John wanted to speak a word that would make his men stronger and the cold less bitter and the sea less of a traitor. Instead he turned and looked at the tower where the rookeries, crows and ravens nested. And as he looked, a black shape flapped out into the twilight, heavy, labored. It faltered once in the wind, dropped low above the harbor, then found a line of air and came on. It hit Davos in the chest as if it knew the way, and the old smuggler caught it by reflex even as it pecked in outrage. The parchment tied to its leg was wax-sealed with a three-headed dragon, and the stamp of a lion's ring pressed into it. Davos broke the seal with a long-nailed thumb and offered it to John without looking at it himself. John read by torchlight that guttered and hissed in the wind. We come, it said, one day out if the weather allows. 2 dragons. If the weather does not allow, we come regardless. John's hand closed around the parchment, and the heat of the torch warmed the wax. He did not smile. He still felt how a smile had felt once, when the world was smaller. But some weight shifted in him like a stone that had been gripping his lungs. That night was a long noise of preparation. He walked it until his legs ached, until Davos scolded him and shoved a bowl of boiled salt mutton into his hands and watched him eat it like a mother wolf. Tormund told stories to the free folk as they worked. Giant's Bow. Ling with boulders, Mance's dying song. The time he stole a giant's wife and the woman carried him for 3 days before she found a slow fire to cook him on. The hound pretended not to listen and then argued the details because inaccuracies offended him in a story the way a dull blade offended him in a fight. Ed practiced loading the scorpion bolts until his fingers bled where the chill had bitten through his gloves and froze him to wood. Gendry guarded his brittle, beautiful arrowheads like a miser with his first coin. Thuras walked among the trenches with a skin of wine and laughed softly at nothing and everything. Beric looked at the sea. Jon moved among men who would die for him and tried not to let it become comfortable. He slept a handful of hours before dawn and dreamed of Hardhome and of the hall at Winterfell and of a coronation in a place that smelled of old wood and smoke where no one would meet his eyes. He woke at the sound of hoofs and boots on stone and the shout from the ramparts. Black specks in the south. Wings. Jon ran up the steps with his cloak unfastened, and the cold bit him wherever it found a gap. He stood on the height where he had stood last night, and there, above the broken light of the rising sun, 2 shapes came on like dark stars. They were smaller than the sky made them and larger than memory would have allowed. The dragons crossed the last miles like anger, like a miracle. When they came to the wall, the wind under their wings boomed in Jon's chest and made his bones sing. Drogon, Regal. He knew their names now the way a man knows the names of storms that have altered his life. They spiraled down toward the open square by the east gate of Eastwatch, and men scattered like beetles before a storm. Jon scrambled to get down as they landed. The shock of their bodies on frozen earth, a tremor that went up through stone, and he was there when their riders slid from their backs. Jorah Mormont's armor was dull with salt and his face drawn with a travel fatigue so deep it looked like hunger. Tyrion Lannister wore furs that made him look like a child pretending to be a bear. And Daenerys Targaryen on the ground across from him was all flame in winter, not for her hair or the cut of her clothing, but for the heat of purpose that she carried with her like an aura. Her breath steamed like any soldier's as she spoke, and her cheeks were chapped from wind, and she had come all the same. "Lord Snow," she said. "Your Grace," he said. There were formal words to be spoken, and they were spoken. And then there were plans to be laid, and those too were laid. Not in the language of courts, but in the language of cold ground and mapped lines in the frost with a dagger point. Jon stood with Davos on one side and Tormund on the other, Daenerys with Tyrion and Jorah, and they argued as people who mean to live argue, with hunger, with humor, with anger only where it served. Your dragons are blades like nothing else on this earth, Davos said. But the man with the spear that killed a horse at 100 paces could have killed a rider just as well. The king, if he is that. He looked at Jon, who nodded once. He unsettles me. You must keep high. You must make your passes only when you know the ground is set. He will not be allowed to take what I have remaining, Daenerys said. Her hand lay on Drogon's warm neck. The dragons I slid open and watched Jon with a gold sliver of judgment. I brought 2 for speed and because I could not leave the south undefended. 2 will suffice if we use them well. We will draw them onto the strand, Jon said. We weaken the ice and hide it. We pull them where the trenches are. We light when the weight is against them. We aim the scorpions for the white ones. You strike where they are thickest, your grace, not where they are deepest. We're not digging out rot, we're cutting nerves. Tyrion raised a hand. And if he refuses to be lured? If he stands and watches with his dead eyes and sends only a handful? If he is as cautious as you are clever? He will not refuse, Tormund said. Nothing in him refuses a chance to follow living heat to where it is brightest. He cannot help it. It is how they hunt. And if this breaks the sea ice in such a way as to give him a crossing further from the wall's protections? Tyrion asked, practical to the marrow. I do not understand these magics. Forgive me, but if the wall's protections extend only so far as the wall itself and the dead find a way around, they cannot go around, Yora said quietly, voice a rasp from too many nights in too many cold camps, the weight of his oath on it. Old tales say the magic goes with the wall wherever it meets the sea. The shore is sealed. It will hold so long as the wall stands. And we mean to ensure it stands, Beric said. Then we do not fail, Daenerys said. She looked at Jon when she said it, and he felt the pledge inside it as much as he heard the command in it. He nodded once, and they began. The weather sharpened that day as if in answer to their audacity. The sky blue as a blade in the morning paled to milk by noon and then thickened to the color of old wool. The wind came first, the kind of wind that snatched and bit and went for the soft parts of a man's face. By evening it had teeth. Snow came then, dry and fine, and the sound of it across the stone was like whispers. They were working by torchlight when Bran's raven came. Jon felt the difference before he saw it. The rookery grew noisy with a bristling sound, as if all the birds inside had gone bright-eyed at once. The raven that dropped out of the gloom at the edge of the yard looked blind, eyes white with a film and fixed on something far. It landed on the scorpion cart and cocked its head, and when the hound tried to shoo it, it bit him hard enough to draw a mouthful of curses that would have made a fat septon faint. Davos plucked the strip of leather from its leg. There was no seal this tea. Only a knot in the thong. Jon took it and read Bran's hand not in ink but in the flowing curves of a mind that looked out of the world at once from every height. He did not show it to anyone. He did not have to. The words were in his bones. They were on the wind. They're near. Jon stood, and the world seemed to go very quiet. They came with the night and the wind and the absence of sound that is the first true sign of fear. The sea stiffened into a sheet beyond the shoals. The waves that had muttered all day fell silent and then froze in the instant of a sigh. The stars were gone, eaten by a pall of cloud. A white mist began to creep along the edge of the water like a snake. Men took their places on the palisade and behind it and along the trenches. The scorpions faced north with their dragonglass-tipped bolts, 3 to a tower. Davos walked the killing field counting under his breath. The hound rolled his shoulders and spat into the snow and drew his sword, and Beric murmured something that sounded almost like thanks. Jon stood by the central trench line with Longclaw's hilt in his palm and watched the dark. He had always thought fear was a sharp thing. Tonight it was a soft pressure, like the weight of heavy snow on a roof that could yet bear it. He held. He waited. The first whites came like flotsam, by 2s and 4s, staggering shapes with frost-burned faces and hands like claws, rising from the sea edge where the ice had crept out to catch them. They were scouts, perhaps, or simply the first ends of a great tide. He saw their eyes in the torchlight and would not give them the dignity of anything as human as hate. They stumbled onto the weakened ice, found it firm, and came on. Torches arced, arrows hissed, and they fell shrieking and hissing into the trenches and burned in tidy lines that smelled like tallow and old rot. Then there was a silence that was not silence, more an inhalation of the world. The white riders appeared at the fog's edge like figures from a tale told in a whisper. They looked as if they did not so much ride as exist in a forward motion. Frost ran from their horses' hooves as if the world were bleeding cold at their steps. There were 3 at first, and then 5, and then perhaps 7. It was hard to count, because the mist itself seemed to serve them as a cloak. Behind them came movement that had no shape at all until it did. Lines and knots and masses of the dead, too many to count, the click and scrape of their feet lost in the muffled world. The world seemed to tilt. "Hold," John said, and his voice sounded far to his own ears. He lifted a hand, palm up, and let it fall when the first rank reached the line he had sketched with his dagger in the frost. Now, the first trench whooshed like a dragon's breath. The oil burned quick and loud, a low wall of fire that turned the night orange and sent shadows staggering. The dead pressed and fell and burned and ached forward. They fell into pits and crawled on burning hands and were pushed over by the pressure of their numbers as new waves came. It was terrible and mechanical and utterly without mind and altogether unstoppable in the way of waves. "Second trench," Davos called, calm as a man counting barrels in a hold. The second line lit, and the heat of it pushed at the watchers. The snow hissed and turned to steam. The whites burned with that peculiar animal shriek that was more hateful than sorrowful. John watched the white riders as the whites burned. They did not move. He had the sense of a man watching a line of tall birds at the edge of a field. Watchful, alien patience. Then one lifted its pale hand a fraction. No more than that. "They're testing," John said. "Test this." The hound growled, and with a shuddering thunk a scorpion bolt sliced the mist, obsidian head a dark tear. The shot was long and the night was bad, and even a sober hand would have missed. But fate, or the gods, if they had not abandoned this shore, like a good bit of insolence. The bolt took the white rider in the side and shattered in a spurt of black glass that vanished into the fog. The thing came apart like the first frost under a boot. It was sudden and almost unceremonious, ice turning to nothing, cloak collapsing with no body in it. For a heartbeat the ranks of whites behind it stuttered, and then in a weird wave that ran backward through the press, hundreds dropped as if the cords that held them had been cut. They did not fall nicely. They went to pieces, legs collapsing, jaws working, arms scrabbling, and then nothing all at once. The line bucked like a harpoon thing. A cheer went up that no one had planned. It made no sense to cheer the dying. It made every sense to cheer a proof. "Again," John said, and it was not clear whether he meant the cheer or the shot. The scorpion spoke, low and heavy, one after another workman sounds. Obsidian bolts hissed into the mist, a dark rain. Somewhere out there something hissed in reply like an icicle breaking. More whites fell. The white riders began to move like chess pieces, as if anger in them translated to velocity. They drew back and then pressed, their dead surging and breaking and surging again. "Hold," John said as one of the walkers approached the angle of the strand where the ice had been cut thin. He saw it like a map in his mind, channels scoured in a crisscross and shrouded by skim. "Hold, hold now." He saw the walker turn its head as the ice beneath its horse groaned. It was too late. The surface shattered in slabs like plates of glass, and the dead poured forward into water that took them with a slick sucking sound. They went down in a mass, hands clutching at air that had no purchase. The sea swallowed them in lumps. The fire lines popped and steamed, heat hitting cold and making the night scream. More bodies pressed and fell. "Watch the right," Davos said, and John looked and saw the press there differently. The dead were falling and falling, filling the pits faster than the fires ate them, building a horrible bridge on their own charred bones. He saw the danger and did not have to speak. The hound leapt the trench and waded into the gap like a man who had been waiting his whole life to meet his hate this way. Beric followed, his sword going up with a low bloom of red fire as it had a dozen times that night. a trick that had always seemed to John like vanity until he saw what it did to the dark. Men followed them over, free folk and black brothers both, and drew a line with steel. "Where is he?" Tormund said, nose white with frozen breath, eyes tearing from smoke. "Where is your tall, cold fucker?" John looked for him in the night. He was there. Of course he was. He was not taller by much. He was not crowned. He did not hold a banner. He was simply more terrible than the others. No breath moved around him. The air made room for him as if offended by his presence. He watched the whole like a farmer watching his wheat in a wind. John could have stayed where he was and told men where to point their bolts and where to step. He could have been a commander the way the dead had a commander. He found his legs moving under him and did not stop them. He came over the palisade with Longclaw, a black idea against softer dark. He did not think of dying and did not think of long after. He thought of one white shape in a world of gray. It moved now, as if to test the ground for itself, delicate where its soldiers had been mindless. It stepped onto the ice as if the sea were a thing owed to it. John slid down into the half-burnt brush of a pit, climbed the far side, and came into a sudden open space where the heat of the fires did not go and the cold felt like bells rung deep in bone. The White One turned its head. It had no face as a man knows faces. It had hollows. It had a suggestion of cheek and jaw and a smooth place where a mouth should be. Its eyes were twin chips of winter. It drew the slow, brittle sword it carried, and the air moaned where it moved. John took 2 steps. Took 2. Longclaw met ice and shrieked, and a shock went up John's arm that would have stripped a lesser grip. He set his teeth. The White One slid and thrust and flicked with a speed that would have looked lazy if it hadn't been perfect. John's heart thundered in his throat, not with fear but with the terrible attention that comes in moments like this. The whole world narrowed to a point. He saw a wash of movement at the edge of vision as a burning white crawled toward his boots, and he kicked it without looking, and the embers that fell from it caught in the brush and flared and gave him a sightline he had not had a heartbeat before. He took it. Longclaw bit into a place on the walker's sword where it had scored itself on Gendry's obsidian dust, a weakness drawn by a desperate experiment hours ago. The ice blade cracked like a dry branch. The walker tilted its head as if in curiosity, and then Tormund hit it from the side with a hammer blow from a length of timber, and that did nothing but stagger it 1 step, and John brought Longclaw up from low as if lifting a river and cut it in the notch below its shoulder. It did not bleed, came apart. It turned to a glittering of frozen nothing that lifted and fell in a hush, and the hush felt like the thing it had been consenting to its own undoing. Around them, 100 dead fell as if a string had been cut. "Ah!" Tormund bellowed, and then, "Look!" John looked up. There were no stars. There was only an absence of dark. It was a shape in the wind, a pocket in the storm. For a second his mind made it a bird, and then a thought, and then the end of the world opening its mouth, and then he knew it for what it was. Daenerys on Drogon's back, Regal crossing behind, both dragons dropping toward the line of the sea like judgment. The storm turned at them. John had never learned to read magic the way he learned to read sword work, but he felt the shift. The air went bitter. The mist went wild, curling upward, then down. A spear of cold deeper than cold itself pressed out from the far line, and for a heartbeat the whole world held its breath. The dragons burned. Fire lashed the strand, and where it ran the dead went to pieces like old cloth in a kiln. The trench lines flared and refilled and flared again. The ice snapped like slate under heat and bodies. John had not realized how tired he had been until the sight of that fire put strength back into his legs like drink. He took 3 steps toward the worst place in the line by instinct, then realized he did not need to, and saved them. There was a roar from the far end of the strand, something like mountains falling. John spun and saw the shape of a massive white bear wading through brush fires and flinging men with paws that could break a horse's back. The hound slid to meet it as if meeting his fate, muttering sounds that were not prayers. Beric went with him, face a weird calm in the firelight. John would have gone but for a flicker of motion on the sea, and he turned as if on a string pulled from behind. The Night King stood at the very edge of the broken ice, the mist a cloak at his back. His head lifted with the listening stillness of a predator. He had a spear in his hand. It was not wood. It was not anything that belonged in a world where men made fires against dark. It glittered in the dragon light. His eyes were blue as noon. "Hi!" Davos said into the world. "Higher." Jon could not make the dragons fly higher with a thought. He could not move himself closer to the Night King in that moment because the ice between them was a new-blown sheet and death under it waited for the weight of a breath. The Night King's arm went back, an easy motion, balanced and sure, and Tyrion shouted something that vanished in the roar, and Daenerys turned Drogon with a knee and a thought. The spear went. It was a beautiful throw. Jon hated it for that. It missed Rhaegal by a man's height because the wind grabbed it at the last, because the dragon twisted at the last, because Davos stood somewhere below and said a word that had been said by a man on a boat once, because the gods had not entirely left the world. The spear struck the ice and sent a crack skittering like a black lightning bolt toward Jon's boots. He stepped back. The Night King adjusted his stance as if curious. Drogon screamed and wheeled, regal dove, and together they burned the place where the spear had cut the world. For a while there was nothing but the doing. The dead came and fell, built bridges of bodies, and were burned off them. The White Riders lost 3 of their number to obsidian bolts and cleverness and fury and withdrew and returned. The dragonfire turned the air into a shimmering, wild thing that made men cough and laugh and weep behind their scarves. Jon moved among it like a man in a half-remembered dance. He cut and shouted and pointed and lifted and went to the worst of the flame and the deepest of the dark and did the obvious and the necessary. He saw Davos yank a man from a trench with a pole as if the man were a fish, saw Gendry rush a scorpion with a new wrapped bolt in his bare hands, saw Ed grin like a skull and sight along the length of a weapon as big as a horse and shoot it like a needle, saw the hound vanish under the bear and then rise from beneath it with his sword buried to the hilt in its belly and Barrack's flaming blade driving down through its skull like a red star into ice. And then, at last, he saw what he had wanted to see and feared to see: hesitation in the white line. The Night King had not moved from his place at the broken edge of the sea. He was a fixed point, the world turning around him. But the White Riders had drawn back and their dead had thinned, the pressure gone from that steady, inexorable push. The field between the palisade and the trenches and the sea was a ruin of ash and melted snow and blackened limbs and the stink of burned things. The Night King looked. That was all he did. And then he turned and walked back into the mist and took his army with him as the tide goes, leaving their dead where they lay, which was everywhere. Silence landed like a stunned bird. Men were suddenly aware of their own breathing, of the painful joy of their own continued existence. Davos sat down very carefully on a barrel because he could not quite remember how to stand without moving. Tormund put his hands on his knees and laughed once, a sound that had nothing of humor in it and everything of relief. The hound cursed at no one and wiped bare gore from his sword with the sleeve of his cloak and then cursed at himself for using his cloak. Barrack leaned on his sword and looked at the sky and said something under his breath that might have been a thank you to a god who had not earned it. Jon stood with Longclaw's tip in the snow and turned in a slow full circle. Men moved like survivors, careful, as if not to startle the stillness. The dragons wheeled once and then climbed into a thinner world where the wind was cleaner and set themselves on 2 towers, the stone bending a fraction under their weight. Daenerys slid from Drogon's back and strode through heat-hazed air toward Jon with her hair whipped straight back by a wind that came from nowhere. "You should have kept further from him," Tyrion said, and it was obvious he had meant to say it later, in council, behind a table, but he could not help himself. "I should have had a 3rd dragon," Daenerys said without bitterness, as if stating a fact about geography. "You should have had no dragons at all if this world were the one it should be," Davos said, and he patted the barrel he was sitting on as if to ask its pardon. Jon's eyes roved over the faces near him and counted and failed to count and counted again. He did not call for a roll of names yet. He looked to where the sea had been and was again and saw the line of black water glittering, the new ice in shards like a broken window. He looked at the White Walkers' corpses. There were none, of course. They did not leave bodies. And at the piles of whites that did not rise when a breeze touched them. He looked at the empty place where the Night King had been as one looks at the absence of a tooth with the tongue. "He'll come again," Barrack said. drawing a polite nod from no one because it was too obvious to be worth answering. "We did what we came to do," Davos said. "We showed them we can make them pay. We showed ourselves we can make them pay. We're not children in the dark anymore. We've learned where to put our hands." "We've learned," Jon said. "He's learned too." They built pyres the next day for what had not already burned to ash, and the smoke rose straight in the still air. Men slept where they fell. Others worked because work kept their minds from the moment when everything they had believed about how the world was ordered had cracked like the ice under their feet. Gendry limped because he had forgotten his legs until they reminded him they were his. Ed counted iron nails because counting anything was proof of order. Tormund ate with both hands like a starving man and told anyone who would listen, "We hit them. Did you see? We hit them where they hurt." Ghost arrived in the afternoon with 2 of the wolves Bran had sent south. Jon did not know how the direwolf had found his way back from wherever he had been, but he felt no surprise at the sight of him. Ghost slipped through the men and the smoke like a slice of winter and put his big head under Jon's hand and made a sound that was not a whine and not a growl and was something like relief. Jon's hand closed in the thick fur until he believed in the solidity of it and of himself. Sansa's raven came a day after with bread and salt and news folded into it. Winterfell was holding. The harvest was thin and the rationing strict and the morale stubborn. Arya had taken it into her head to inventory the armory and the kick. Hen and had frightened 3 grown men by appearing behind them like an idea of retribution. Bran sent no words, but Jon felt him as one feels a change in pressure, across the back of the neck, behind the eyes. The tide of relief that had washed through the Watch and the Free Folk and the Dragon Queen's retinue began to recede. It left behind sober thoughts and bright, hard plans. "He lost 3, Tyrion said that night in the makeshift war room. A square chamber off the old Eastwatch hall that had a maps table dragged into it and half the chairs broken because they had never expected to seat so many. We lost more than that in men, but the dead do not reckon those losses as we do, and the White Walkers are not men. 3 may be more than we think. How many are there? You have seen what you have seen." He glanced at Jon as one might glance at a cliff in heavy surf. "We must learn the count if we can. If he has 10 and we have struck 3, that is a wound. If he has 100, that is a scratch. It is a lesson," Yora said. "He will not present them to our scorpions again so kindly." "Then we must be less kind," Tormund said. "We go out and hunt them like stags. The moment we leave the wall's shadow, we become small things in a huge frozen world that only favors them," Davos said. "I am an old sailor, not a strategist, but even I can see that." "We do both," Daenerys said. "We hold this place and harden its lines, and we make small strikes where we can. We use the dragons when we must and as little as we dare. We make them doubt their invulnerability. The dead have nothing to lose, but the ones who lead them have something like a sense of self. They hate to be mocked." "Sounds like a Lannister," the Hound muttered. "I will have men sent from Winterfell," Jon said, looking at Daenerys and seeing her watch him with the same concentrated attention he gave to her. "We will not strip the North. The living must stay alive. But this place will be better held if it is held fully. We will need more rope, more bolts, more oil, more hands." "You will have them," Daenerys said. "Send your ravens. I will send mine. I will send what ships I dare up the coast. We will make Eastwatch a mouth the dead choke on." They did. 10 days remade the place again. The sea offered a narrow kindness. A stretch of better weather, cold and bright. The sky a brittle blue. White Harbor's tar came, thick as treacle, and the whale oil arrived along with a ship whose crew had eyes like slits against the empty, glaring world. The men of Bear Island arrived with axes and a ferocity that made the free folk grin and clap them on the back as if they were kin they had only just found. More scorpions came by sled and hand and sheer stubbornness from Castle Black. Dolorous Ed complaining the whole way that he would much prefer to die in the safety of his bed, were such a thing possible. Gendry invented things as if invention itself were a kind of courage. He built a box of iron lined with brick that he called a stove for melting tar safer and quicker. He formed new heads for the scorpion bolts with obsidian set into iron cages so that even if the glass shattered, the shards would fly forward like a flock of blackbirds with the same intent. He showed John a knife he had hafted in elk horn and weighted in a way that made it want to sit properly in the hand, and said shyly, "It will go through bones." Sandor tested the knife on a pig's thigh and grunted and kept it. Daenerys did not leave. She and her dragons owned the high sky. They flew at odd hours and unnerved men who had not yet learned that some predators are allied. Jon watched her sometimes and told himself that what he saw was only leadership and the crooked fate of two people caught in the same stupid history. He believed it until he did not. 2 weeks after the first battle, they felt it again, the lift of the world that meant the dead were moving. This time the fog came up suddenly out of a clear afternoon, swallowing the horizon with a steadiness that felt like purpose. The men at the traps along the strand took their places with the practiced ease of people who had learned that a thing could be done. The dragons rose and settled in the high thin air, not yet diving. Jon had the sense of a game played for the second time by adversaries who had already learned too much about one another. The dead pressed less centrally this time. They splayed along the shore as if to find weakness. The White Riders hung back longer. The Night King was nowhere to be seen. "He tests the sides," Davos said, pointing with 2 fingers, a sailor's habit. He had marched the lengths of the palisades and trap lines as if they were decks and knew each as he knew the weather. "He means to see if our cleverness has edges." "Everything does," Tyrion murmured. "Shift the scorpions to the right," Jon said. "Keep one reserve by the harbor. If he rushes there, he means to test the wall itself. The ice is thicker. We can't break it the way we did before." They fought smarter that day and suffered for it in stranger places. A knot of whites appeared in the harbor proper, crawling across an unripe skin of ice that cracked and reformed under them in a way that made a mockery of the world's physics. Ed's men burned them and then watched in awe as burned bodies kept moving long enough to set the water itself alight with a slick that had spilled from a tar barrel, and then the wind shifted and the flames curled back toward the men on the wall, and they had to scramble down chain ladders and through smoke with their eyebrows singing. The Hound laughed, coughing, and declared it the best bath he had taken in months of cold. On the far left, the dead came up against a place where the rocky shore made the trench lines awkward and tried a hard press there. Tormund stood on a boulder and swung an iron-studded club and told stories as he fought, of a winter when he had eaten snow melted in a giant's he. Lumet, and it had been the finest soup he had ever had, and of a summer when a woman had kissed him so hard it had cracked a tooth. The men around him shouted and hit harder and did not die. Jon stayed mobile, and it saved him more than once. He felt the pattern shift and knew, without seeing it, that the White Riders were threading through the fog to seek angles. He sent a bolt through one he glimpsed on a rise of ice and thought he had missed, and then a line of dead fell where they stood as if someone had reached behind their hearts and cut a wire. He took a breath that felt like stealing. And then it became clear that the Night King's absence was not absence but intent. The fog thickened, then thinned. The wind went wrong. A sound like the broken end of a horn came from north of the harbor, from a place where the wall curved down toward the sea and a small notch had been carved centuries ago to allow men to pass to a lower path. Jon felt his mouth go dry. The notch was old and sealed by ice. It had always been sealed. Someone had unsealed it, just enough to make the world wonder. And there, in that notch, a shape stood that absorbed light and expectation. The Night King did not throw a spear this time. He lifted an arm and the fog thickened as if he were kneading it. "No," Jon said, and he was not sure if he meant the notch or the plan or the way the world itself had consented to be a place where there was a Night King. He ran, and everything else ran to match him. Tyrion with a look of helpless fury at his own short legs. Davos with his hand on his side and his mouth set. The Hound swearing at the fog as if it could be made to feel shame. Beric a streak of brand. Tormund laughing, maddened by exhaustion and joy, which are cousins. They reached the notch to find it not open, not yet, but thinner. The ice there had changed. It was no longer ancient and deep and sure. It was young ice, loud with its own growth, crazed with hairline fractures. It screamed like a living thing when the wind pressed it just so. The Night King had not brought a dragon to melt the wall. He had brought patience to shape it. "Gendry," Jon said to the world, and the world obliged. The smith came skidding, dragging a cart on 2 runners. On it lay a canvas. He threw the canvas back. "What in 7 hells?" the hound began, and then shut his mouth, because even in 7 hells there are some things you do not mock. The thing Gendry had built was a stout iron cradle holding a barrel of tar bound with iron hoops and stuffed about with dry brush and fuses braided from rope dipped in oil. It was not complicated. It was a bomb made by a man who had watched the wind for a week and learned how it blew through a notch where the wall met the sea. "Light it," Jon said, and Beric did, setting the fuse alight with a gentle kiss of his odd red flame and then stepping back. Gendry and the hound heaved the cradle forward on its runners to the edge where the ice thinned, and the hound kicked it hard with a grunt that was almost eloquent. It slid, slow at first and then faster, down the neat little channel men had carved quietly yesterday when the world had been quiet, and when it hit the thinnest place and came hard up against the young ice that keened like a frightened dog, it exploded. Tar went in a low, heavy cough of fire that hugged the ground and flowed into cracks. The young ice screamed and came apart in great panicked pieces that shoved against older ice and made that scream too. The tide took the burning tar into the new gap and held it there because it had nowhere else to go, and because Davos had dragged a submerged chain there at dawn and set it just so, like a fisherman baiting a trap. The gap became a wound. The wound became a canal. The canal became a throat of fire that licked at the base of the wall's old ice, while the new ice melted and shattered and remade itself and shattered again in a quick cycle that could not build toward anything because it was always being pushed back to the start. The Night King did not move. He stood and watched. Jon watched him watching and understood a thing he had not understood. The Night King could break the world if he had a tool. He was testing to see if the world would break itself for him. The world had declined. Good. Jon did not smile. He took a breath as if he could drink that small victory and keep it in his belly against the cold. They held that day and the next, and in the holding they made Eastwatch more than it had been. The place acquired a personality like a blade takes an edge. It taught them things about itself they had not known, and they taught it how to fight like something alive and stubborn. The dead came and tested and withdrew. The Night King appeared often enough to remind them that he was there and seldom enough to make them doubt their senses. The dragons slept on the towers and woke and flew and acted as if they too had joined the place, had made a choice. Men told stories in the yard not to pass the time but to give it a shape, and they shaped each other with those stories into the kind of people who stand when standing will do. Sansa's next raven came with a drawing Bran had made in a hand not his own. A map of the coast north of Hardhome where a fjord bit into the land like a mouth full of broken teeth. There was a mark there. Jon traced it with a finger and felt, in that odd way that information carried in certain contexts, the shape of a patrol route for the White Riders that would take them out of easy reach of the army and into a bottleneck. He took the map to Davos. Davos studied it and blew out his breath and said, "We will need small boats, and men who do not think much of drowning." Jon took it to Daenerys and she said, "You will have the sky if you need it, but do not ask for what you do not need." He took it to Tormund and the Hound and Beric and Ed and Gendry. They nodded, some reluctantly, some with what passed for enthus. Iasm in men who had lived long enough to distrust that feeling. Ghost lay beside the fire and raised his head and thumped his tail exactly once, as if awarding a vote. They went on a bright cold morning when the sea lay like hammered steel and the wind took a day off as if to watch them make their foolishness. They took 3 slim boats dragged by sleds over the hard sand and then slid into water that did not yet resent them. They rowed like sinners eager for shrift, slow, steady. The fjord took them in, felt like a throat. The cliffs were stubs of teeth capped with snow. The air tasted of salt and rock and nothing else at all. They were far up it when the first White Rider appeared on a ridge above, the world's light curving around it as if to avoid offense. Jon held up a fist and the oars went still. Sound died. The rider turned its head. Another appeared. The third. They moved as if their horses' feet did not care for stone. Jon saw how they threaded along a narrow shelf and understood that monsters risked danger too, or else never made any gains. He signaled. Beric lifted his hand and a spot of fire bloomed against stone where it did not belong. The White Riders turned, all at once, as if they had heard a word. The hound threw the first harpoon toward the shelf with both hands like a man throwing his best stone at a dog that has his last meat in its teeth. The iron head bit and held in a crack. The rope slewed and went taut. Gendry hauled. It hauled. Men hauled who had never hauled a harpoon line before and found that all they were hauling was the idea of a limit. The shelf shuddered. A rock the size of a cart shook loose and fell, and the White Rider's horses skittered. One horse fell. Its rider rose. No time elapsed. It simply was up and stepped lightly aside, but not lightly enough. Another harpoon went in lower. The shelf came apart with a dry boom, and a hollow boom beneath that told of caverns. 2 White Riders went with it, and something like a silvered crackle ran out from them in the air, and the sound of it made the hair lift on Jon's arms under his furs. Whites in a hollow far behind them fell down like sacks, as if in obedience to a command that had been cancelled. The 3rd rider leaped sideways, preternatural, and would have made the far lip if a shape darkened the mouth of the fjord, and the air's pressure changed and a dragon slid down the throat of the world like fire sliding down a flue. Drogon did not burn the shelf and risk the boatman. He blew heat as if exhaling a sigh along the cliff face, and frost fled him, and the rock sweated and then cracked, and the shelf found out it did not want to be a shelf anymore, and down it went. The rider went with it and broke itself on a lower ledge, not through gravity but through a principle that governed both magic and stone. A limit met. It was not easy. The dead came, as they came everywhere, in numbers. They came down the cliff face under their own mindless weight and formed ladders of limbs. They rose out of clefts like damp and made the boats ring with the weight of their insistence. Jon fought and bled and slipped on the bottom boards and thought of nothing but the next place to put the sword and the next place to put the oar and how to keep the 2 ideas from becoming one. Ghost stood on the bow of one boat and tore at what tried to climb on and did not mind the taste. By the time they came back out into the clean sky beyond the fjord's mouth, the sea looked amused at their temerity. Jon looked back. The shelf was gone. The White Riders there had died in a way that had sent a message through the web of their will. He did not know how many distant knots of dead had fallen. He did not need to. The night would tell them. He thought of the Night King feeling that tug, that taking. He assumed the thing could feel. He refused to have enemies beyond the reach of his imagination. News of such small victories traveled strangely. Men felt taller. The stories they told around the fire at the end of the day grew teeth and lost some gore. Tyrion began to keep a tally in a neat hand. Not that the gods or the dead would be impressed by a ledger, but because men were. He wrote, 3 White Riders on the strand, 3 in the fjord, an unknown number felled with each. He wrote, 100 dozens of whites burned and broken. He wrote, supplies low, spirits hard. He wrote, the notch held, did hold. The Night King stood at its lip 3 times in a week and looked into it and did nothing, which was not nothing. He learned them and they learned him. There is a kind of intimacy in that. Jon understood it and wished not to. Winter swelled and contracted with the weird rhythm of a living thing's breathing. There were days when the world had geometry and reason, when the sun moved across the sky in a proper arc and men counted hours on their fingers and felt like they were not mad. There were other days when time puckered and stretched, when fog came in like an idea from nowhere and sat on the world with a stupid weight, when men saw things at the corner of their eyes and did not speak of them because the naming would give them life. On one of those days, a ship appeared out of fog that had no right to be there, black-sailed and sly, and Davos himself took the skiff to meet it because he did not trust the men he had and did not trust anyone else either. He came back with the news that Euron Greyjoy had sniffed the coast and found it not to his liking and gone south to break someone else's ribs instead. Davos spat and said, "There's a bad one with a good nose. We keep our fires low on the bad days." They kept them low. They kept their quarrels lower still, not because they had become saints, but because survival shapes the mind sharply. The Hound found a wildling boy stealing rations and cuffed him, and then gave him twice as much food and told him, "If you're going to steal, steal more. It's not worth my time if I have to beat you for crew." MBS. The boy loved him for it and followed him like a less feral dog for days. Gendry woke with his face pressed to a sheet of iron and a smear of drool glued to it because exhaustion had taken him like a thief. He laughed when Davos teased him and slept in a proper place the next night. Tormund asked Daenerys if she had ever lain with a man with a beard like a bear. She laughed, because she was in a good mood and because Tyrion was nearby with a face as if he had just bitten a lemon, and said, "No." And Tormund said, "That's because you've not been at Eastwatch long enough. Ghost killed a white cat that had sprung up out of a barrel like a jack-in-the-box that had waited 2 months too long. It would have gone badly for the cook it was headed for." Ghost shook it and snapped its spine and then paced in a ring around the kitchen while men thanked him and the cook cried, and Ed attempted to give the wolf a salted cod in reward and got an expression in return that said without words, "I am not a dog." The second great battle was not announced by fog or a horn or a change in the wind so much as by an accumulation of the small sharp things that mean something large is about to happen. Bran's crow did not come. The sky stayed clear longer than it had any right to. The ice at the notch sang a better song. With a high fluted note in it Ed said meant strain deep inside the cold. Jon woke with a sense of being watched and did not think this sensation fanciful or the product of poor sleep. He stood on the wall and felt eyes. He felt an attention so keen it seemed to lift every hair on his body until he wanted to crouch like a hunted thing. He did not crouch. "They come again," he said, and he watched the horizon and saw the line on it draw itself darker. "They come with intent." The dead came not as a tide this time but as a point, a wedge driving at the harbor where the ice most easily sought to become land. They came with little of the threshing mindlessness of earlier presses and more of the eerily disciplined violence he had seen only when their riders were thick about them. He saw them set their own dead alight with a cold blue fire that was not fire as men understand it, and throw those burning bodies into trenches and pits to make bridges that did not burn the same way they had before. He saw their riders linger behind the wedge and then dart in like needles to draw blood at the edges. He saw the Night King and did not see him, and then saw him again, farther left, and then realized with a strange widening of the mind that there were moments when he was seeing an echo, or a choice not yet made, and that to act on those echoes would be to waste arrows on ghosts. They adapted, then. Men not only can, men must. Jon sent the dragons not on straight scything runs but on slantwise swoops that drew the wedge to angle its force toward stone and not toward the soft places where men stood. He let the dead throw their burning bodies into his fires and then added oil at the last cruel second so that their bitter light did their work for them. He sent scorpion bolts not at white riders who had learned how to lean away into mist but at the knots of whites around them. Because when one walker died, the web broke in a radius that was unpredictable and beautiful. He sent Ghost where the press was worst and then called him back because the wolf too had a limit. It was terrible and beautiful and long. It was a song sung in steel and ash, too loud for living ears, and when it was done, men lay again on the ground sucking in the great greedy lungs, full of joy that feel guilty to draw when friends do not. Jon stood with Longclaw in his hand and did something he had not done that day. He looked around for Daenerys not because he needed to command or be commanded, but because he needed to see whether the idea of her coming north had been a thing the world would continue to allow. She stood by Drogon's shoulder with her eyes lifted to the sky as if she were reading there. She looked sidewise and saw him, and her mouth moved into a shape that was not a smile and was not a smile. It was a shape that said, "I am unbroken." He nodded and then looked away so that he would not think of anything but the fact of her stillness in that wind. They counted later. They counted names and bolts and jars of oil and the time until the next decent sleep. Tyrion scratched ink until the quill split. Davos dreamed of decks and woke with frost on his eyelashes. Tormund snored in a manner that may have been threatening to the structural integrity of the hall. They waited. They did not tell themselves it would be over until it was over. They did not lie. That is not heroism. That is survival. And one night, late in a stretch of days when even the weather seemed to have forgotten it had once been anything but their adversary and sometimes their ally, the world sound dropped out in a way Jon now knew and would always know. He rose. He did not hurry. He went to the wall and looked. The horizon was featureless. There was no bright spear of fog or sudden mute thunder of snow. There was only the sense of attention. It was like a word spoken by a voice he could not hear with his ears. He heard it all the same. The Night King would come. He would come as if to a parley. He would not speak. Jon would give him fire and iron and the taste of failure and the taste of possibility both at once. He would keep him here another day and another day again and another after that, because sometimes victory is not a seizure of ground but a refusal to yield a particular yard of it. He put his hand on the ice of the wall and felt the old magic there, dull as a bone and as stubborn. He did not ask it for anything. He did not insult it with prayer. He acknowledged it the way a man acknowledges a dog that has guarded his door every night of his life and will guard it tonight and will someday be gone, and the nights after will be quieter in a way that is unbearable. Come then, he said to the horizon. Come and see. They came. They always came because that is what it meant to be them. They came and broke themselves and remade themselves and learned in the remaking. So did the living. That is what it meant to be them. They burned and froze and bled and laughed. They made traditions in a month. They made jokes that would not be funny in any other place. They made a wall of men and rope and tar and obsidian and dragon and wolf and stubbornness. They learned that enemies can be studied and that the study is a kind of respect and that respect is sometimes the foundation of victory. At Eastwatch by the sea, where the world ends and does not, they turned the sea into an accomplice. They taught the dead to fear the edge of water and fire together. They taught themselves to be the kind of people who can do that. In the mornings after, when the smoke lifted straight up and the sun looked like a pale coin a god had dropped and forgotten, Jon Snow stood by the notch and counted the loud singing of the ice and knew the world a little better and not at all. Sansa's last letter of that season said, "The North holds. Keep the end. We've food enough if we are clever and deferred some pain with better counting and bundles of reed in the marshy places and more salt on the meat. Arya is a whisper that eats rats. Bran sees them in dreams. He says you are where you must be. Come home when you can. If you cannot, stand." Jon folded the parchment along the old creases until it was a small square that fit between his breast and Longclaw's worn leather. He made his rounds. He tightened a rope that did not need tightening and said something brief to Gendry about the balance of a new spear and ate a bowl of cabbage soup made thinner with snow and congratulated Ed on his sour humor and listened to Davos telling him in detail about the time he had outrun a storm with a cargo of onions because he had known the inshore tides too well for the storm to catch him. He stroked Ghost's ears. He stood with Daenerys on the wall and said nothing. She said nothing. The silence felt like something made, not found. In the night they came again. And in the morning, some of them did not rise. That was the measure. That was enough and far from enough. That was the war now, a long, cold lesson in the art of not yielding. At Eastwatch by the sea, where the Great Wall met the Great Water and the world made a poor agreement with itself and honored it too long for anyone to break it easily, men learned to be a mouth. They learned to be a held knife. They learned to be bait and not broken. In the years after, when songs were made and lies were told and the dead were given a different shape because people cannot hold long fears without flattening them into tales, old men nodded toward the eastern wind and said, "It started turning there." That is a kind of truth too. Jon stood with the taste of salt on his tongue and the sense of waiting in his bones. He did not belong to the south or the north, not entirely, not ever, but he belonged to this edge. He belonged to the line where one thing says to another, "You shall not pass here, not because I am stronger, but because I will be here tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that, and you will break yourself on my ordinary, relentless presence." He did not think himself a hero. He did not think anything of himself at all that night as the white line appeared again at the dark rim and the dragons rose as one and the wolf's ears came forward and Davos's breath fogged and the hound's mouth twisted and Tormund laughed and Barrack's blade bloomed and Ed cursed the cold and the bolts were fitted and the tar was primed and the traps lay quiet beneath their quilts of snow. He thought, here. And in that word was the whole of the plan and the promise and the trap and the prayer. Here. And if the dead had ears for such words, perhaps they heard it then and learned it as their first and last lesson. They came on. The sea shivered. The wall sang. Eastwatch made ready a third time and a fourth and a fifth beyond dear counting. This is how a world holds, by repetition, by craft, by choosing the place of the lure and the line and then never moving it unless you mean to. When men tell you of great turning wars, they speak of the one blow, the one break. They forget the days before and after when ordinary choices shaped the edge. Jon did not forget. He lived them. He set his feet. He lifted his sword. He breathed, and the steam of it ran away into the air with all the breath of all the living who had ever stood a line and learned the trick of making fear into a brace instead of a break. He breathed again and went forward as if he were both bait and blade and the man who set them, because he was. And the dead learned to hate a place where the living knew what they were doing, which is to say, they learned to fear Eastwatch, and in learning it grew less inevitable. That is enough of a difference to make a world.